dear the honored guests and the conference participants. Thank you very much for your attendance for the keynote speaking sessions. Let's continue. And before we start with the keynote speakers, I would like to introduce Professor Nguyễn Thoại, the editor-in-chief of the ACBES journals, and also the chairman of our conference, to speak and introduce the keynote speakers. Please.
Thank you, Khánh Hoàng. Could you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very well.
Thanks. Was like Oxley already raise your hand. So good morning, everyone. In this morning from Vietnam. Let me introduce our keynote speaker for this section from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. So Professor Lex Oxley is a professor in economics at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. So he's working in a management school. He's also adjunct professor at Curtin University and affiliate as a motto. Right. He is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand since 2006. His research interests very diversified, not only include circular economy, that's the topic he will be presenting today with us, but also other topics such as sustainable economic development, economic well-being, time series econometrics, and especially he also written current paper regarding to financial econometrics, especially related to cryptocurrencies. That the topics are very new at the moment around the world and also in Vietnam. Besides that, he also written some paper regarding to plyometrics, economic histories, the economic of innovation, energy, economic, about histories of his career. He was chair of the business and economics panel of the 2018 performance-based research fund in New Zealand research assessment exercises. He is a co-editor in chief of John, founding editor of the Journal of Economic Surveys, and also a member of governance group of the National Sciences Challenges. He will receive 7 Marden-funded grants and published on a wide range of topics. He is currently engaged in research on the circular economies that the case studies he will provide to us in our keynote section today, and also mentioning about New Zealand cases, and also he also researched about the effect of COVID-19 on financial market, the effects of globalization of the well-being of all New Zealanders. So very much experiences, not only in circular economy and also with various topics. Today, we warmly welcome Professor Les Oxley from University of Waikato in New Zealand. So now please take your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you today. I'll just share my screen if that's okay now.
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
So, okay, so I'm going to talk today about a research program rather than a simple paper. And I'm talking to you today from my home. The whole of New Zealand is locked down for the next few days, as many of you have probably experienced already. So I'm not far away from my office. And for those of you that have not been to New Zealand before, here's a little arrow that shows you roughly where I am at the moment in New Zealand, in Hamilton, New Zealand. So it is a great pleasure to talk to you today. And I'm going to quite briefly, I think, talk about the work that we're doing here in New Zealand around the possibility of sustainably increasing well-being by embedding notions of circularity at various levels of the New Zealand economy, the micro level, the meso level, and the macroeconomic level. And one thing that I want to emphasize quite strongly as I go through the work today, and I think it's something that if I've got time at the end, I'd like to address a few points towards circularity and Vietnam and other Asian countries. One thing that's really important to the work that we're doing is that we are focusing particularly on sustainability and circularity within the context of New Zealand. And in New Zealand, we have 20% of our population which are indigenous people, the Maori people, and it is very important when we're starting to think about circularity and sustainability that we are aware that there are some quite significant cultural differences between New Zealand Maori and New Zealand Europeans. And I'll bring those points out as we go through. So maybe one thing I can sort of talk about just at the beginning, Amiomio, Āotearoa, that wouldn't be very easy for you to even find out what that meant if you went onto Google Scholar or went onto Google while I'm talking. Amiomio is a Maori word, and it means going round and round in a spiral until you come to a single point. So Amiomio is really about circularity, and Āotearoa is just a Maori word for New Zealand. So Amiomio Āotearoa is sort of picking up the idea of circularity in New Zealand. So we have in our research a particular challenge that we have to answer, and that is a shift to a circular economy the key to sustainably increasing the well-being of all New Zealanders? Now, this question is a question that was raised by the New Zealand Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, and we've been charged to answer that question over the next 5 years using a New Zealand $10 million grant funded by the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment. We're sort of about 9 months into the project, so we haven't got the answer yet, but we certainly have some structure that I can hopefully share with you today. So let me give you some idea about what this research program is all about. So our ultimate goal for this question is to sustainably increase the well-being of all New Zealanders. And that's our goal. And it's a goal that I think many countries and many governments are themselves striving to do in many different ways. And they might not call it well-being, but effectively, that's the sort of thing that many countries are trying to do. The sustainability part is really important for us, and I think it's really important for many economies and for the world. And by sustainability, we're picking up some particular notions of sustainability. If any of you have looked in this area and done a Google search, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of different versions of what sustainable and what sustainability means. But what we mean, basically because we've got a strong economics background, is that something is sustainable if tomorrow's generations have at least the same level of well-being as current generations. So this is an intertemporal thing. So something will be sustainable, well-being will be sustainable if tomorrow's generations have at least the same as we've got today. If we're consuming too much, then well-being will not be sustainable because there won't be the resources and the capital available for future generations. And we're looking to see whether circularity is the way that we can ultimately sustainably increase well-being. And I'll talk a little bit more, obviously, about what we mean by a circular system very shortly. So we have a team involved in trying to answer this question. And our team has various tasks, various things to do. The first is to define and measure what we mean by well-being. In the same way as we've got many different measures and different versions of what sustainability means, we've got many different versions of what people mean by well-being. We have an extra dimension because within our definition and our attempts to measure well-being, we've been given the task of integrating both Western and Maori paradigms. We've got to integrate things which would be very common for anyone in the OECD, that's what I'm calling Western, and other versions of well-being that come from Maori culture. The second task our team has is to define and measure sustainability and circularity. And again, we have to define and measure these concepts, integrating Western, OECD, and Maori paradigms. And that's where the difference in our work is most obvious. The third set of tasks that the people in our program have is that when you look at the idea of circularity, and I'll give you some examples of this again pretty shortly, circularity and circular models normally involve the creation and adoption of new materials, new products. And we'll see why new materials and new products are important for circularity. But we have a group of scientists, engineers, material scientists, whose role it is to create new materials and to demonstrate within a New Zealand context that there are things that have the properties that circularity would require, and we can create them in New Zealand, and New Zealand businesses can see them and they can use them. So this is an important element of our work as well. And finally, we have a group of people whose job it is to embed sustainability, circularity, introduce businesses to new materials, new processes in the economy. These sorts of issues require different skills, and we have people from management, we have economists, we have behavioral economists in particular, and we have lawyers. And the reason why we have lawyers is that it's pretty clear from much of the existing literature, and it's pretty clear from some of the environmental issues in New Zealand, that markets sometimes fail to allocate resources appropriately. And then you need some sort of intervention. And the lawyers in our team are there to guide us as to how these market failures might be resolved through the use of new laws or new statutes. We've only got 5 years. We've only got a limited amount of money. So initially, the project is going to focus on packaging and building materials and buildings as the sorts of cases that we're going to focus on when we're talking about new materials and when we're talking about circularity and when we're talking about sustainability. Packaging and building give us some of the somewhat easier cases to deal with initially, but also they involve quite significant areas where circularity is important. So at a theoretical problem, however, the problem that we face is that there's no model out there that we can find that actually fully integrates well-being, sustainable development and circular economy. There's models of well-being, there's models of sustainable development, and there's models of circular economy. But there's no single sort of model that puts these things all together. And some of us in the team, and that includes me, are focusing on trying to create that integrated model right now. So here's some of our team. These are part of our Waikato team. Here we have a couple of my Maori colleagues. We have our lawyer. We have me over here. And we have our team leader, Kim, who's an engineer by training. But the total number of people working on our project is about 80. And we have people from every New Zealand university. Here's many of their logos. Many of the New Zealand research institutes, independent institutes funded by the government. That includes the building organization, Brands over here, Scion, which deals with wood. Here's our Maori Institute. We have overseas universities. We've got Lancaster University, we've got University College London, and we've got Brno University of Technology in Czechoslovakia. These are some of the people who are working and helping us on the project. So our challenge is to find ways to sustainably increase the well-being of all New Zealanders, understanding that there are differing values from differing groups. And then we have the aim and requirement that we try and evaluate the impact of the work that we're doing. So one of the things that we have to be able to demonstrate is that we have a version of well-being that incorporates both traditional OECD Western notions of well-being and incorporates and integrates into that definition concepts from Maori, from our indigenous population. Now, just to show you that the task is not easy, Joe Stiglitz has famously said GDP is not a good measure of economic performance. Well, I think more people are starting to understand that, but also it's not a good measure of well-being. So we sort of face a challenge from one of the intellectual giants in the discipline, that using GDP as a measure of well-being is, not going to be the best thing to do. New Zealand Treasury has started to, and basically operates a version of a measure of well-being that they call the New Zealand Living Standards Framework. And the Living Standards Framework is based upon Treasury's idea of what they call the 4 capitals. So to New Zealand Treasury, intergenerational well-being relies on the growth, distribution, and sustainability of these 4 capitals. So in principle, New Zealand Treasury has tried to and has created a version of something which has well-being and sustainability related to these 4 capitals. And these 4 capitals are natural capital. Natural capital are things like soil, land, water, minerals, energy resources, both renewable and non-renewable minerals, renewable and non-renewable resources. And there have been quite successful ways of trying to measure natural capital as part of the OECD by putting a monetary value on natural capital and working out whether natural capital is growing or not by seeing whether the monetary value of natural capital increases over time. The second measure of capital is human capital, and this encompasses people's skills and knowledge, Again, there have been attempts to measure human capital, either in terms of expenditure on education or in terms of lifetime earnings from different skills. And again, if we can find that the monetary value of human capital is increasing, then it allows for the possibility that well-being might increase over time. Physical and financial capital is a bit more obvious. This includes factories, roads, houses, cars, vehicles, trucks, and assets, financial assets. And these, again, are relatively easy to put some dollar value on. So if the dollar value of natural, human, financial, if they're increasing over time or one is increasing over time, then there's a possibility that well-being might be increasing intertemporally. But the fourth capital that New Zealand Treasury believes is important is this thing called social capital. And this is where New Zealand Treasury and many other countries that have this notion of a social dimension to capital start to find difficulties in putting a dollar measure on them. But they're particularly important in the New Zealand context. Traditional versions of social capital are things like the rule of law and trust and those sorts of things. In a New Zealand context, the relationship between the Crown, the government effectively, and Māori is part of social capital. And here it's much more difficult to put a dollar value on these things. It's right in this group that we are spending much of our time working with Māori to try and find out how we can potentially measure social capital. Now, issues that arise from the New Zealand Treasury view of the four capitals is, are the four capitals growing and are they likely to be sustained? That's important because intertemporal well-being in the Treasury view is based upon the capitals growing, and if they're not, intertemporal well-being will not be growing. Are there social and demographic inequalities in well-being? So the way it's been presented so far is that there's been no account taken of whether there are demographic inequalities. So if well-being is increasing, is everyone getting the same proportion of that increase in well-being? And we know, again, from many countries that inequality is one of the biggest problems to solve once we've managed to solve issues of growth. And finally, how does the current flow of benefits impact on long-term outcomes? So if we take too much well-being today, what impact will this have on future generations? If we take too little impact today, how will that impact on current generations? Well, the four capitals underpin Treasury's view of well-being, but in order to measure progress, we need some sort of indicators of well-being. And here we have a range of measures of current well-being that New Zealand Treasury use to identify whether well-being is increasing. One of them they call material standard of living, which is effectively GDP per capita. But there are many others that add along to this, jobs and earnings. We know from many studies that if you have a job, you're more likely to have more well-being, feel happier than if you don't have a job. Health, if you're healthier, you'll tend to have more well-being than if you're not so healthy. Environmental quality. We know if air quality is bad, it will affect health, but it also may directly affect your well-being. So New Zealand Treasury have these indicators driven by these four capitals along the bottom here. And if we start to put this into an international comparative basis, we add in another form of capital, the one in red here, which is net claims on the rest of the world, and it's measured by net financial capital. So this is effectively where we stand at the moment in terms of a New Zealand's Treasury version of what well-being is and what determines well-being. Let's introduce some particularly important Maori perspectives on well-being and sustainability. One thing that is really important to Maori, and remember they're over 20% of our population, is what they call mataranga. So mataranga is traditional knowledge. Wairotatanga is about spirituality. Maori is about life essence. We can think of these as, within a Western concept, as additional issues related to human capital. So traditional knowledge is important to Maori, as well as learned knowledge from education. So we're trying to work out, how do we integrate traditional knowledge into our measure of human capital? How do we integrate spirituality into our model of human capital? And how do we integrate this thing called life essence into human capital? Now, we're making some progress on the first and limited progress on the second, but this is quite early days. But we do have a language, we do have an ability now to work out how and what we would add in. To give another example, tikanga, kawa, and tapu, these govern how Maori interact with the natural environment. So we can think about these things as, how can we incorporate these concepts from Maori into our measure of natural capital? So although the words sound quite different, and they sound quite different to European New Zealanders, never mind people from Vietnam, so it's not just you, Europeans here find these things difficult to comprehend, but they're fundamentally important to Maori, and therefore they're fundamentally important to us. Maori well-being itself as a concept is quite different too. Maori well-being is based upon what is called the whānau, or the family, or a collective society, a hapu or an iwi, which we can think about as tribes. So getting more well-being to individuals comes via the family. So if we're thinking about a traditional European view of the world, we would think about giving well-being to individuals. And if we wanted to know about family well-being, we'd just add up the number of people in the family. In a Maori perspective, the idea is that you increase well-being for the family, and the family decides how to distribute that well-being to individuals. So it turns everything quite on its head, fundamentally different. Let's move on to sustainable development. So sustainable development, we're going to be using the traditional Brundtland notion as a starting point for our version of sustainable development. And that's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's traditional. We have within this notion of sustainability a range of different versions of sustainability: weak sustainability, strong sustainability, environmental or ecological footprint, or carrying capacity. And we start off by assuming that our economic model our economic system that we are trying to investigate is one that is weakly sustainable. We're pretty sure that that will have to change once we introduce Maori values. But the thing about weak sustainability that's attractive is that all capital inputs, all the 4 capitals that Treasury has been talking about are assumed to be perfect substitutes in production. So that allows us to work within a system where increasing one capital will make a contribution by potentially substituting for any decline in natural capital. So more human capital can, in a weakly sustainable world, compensate for declines in natural capital. If we assumed that the economy was strongly sustainable, then that substitution would be less likely to occur. One reason why weak sustainability is chosen most often and chosen by those working from the World Bank is that it has a particular outcome. So assuming that we have a production process which is weakly sustainable, then an economy which saves more than the combined depreciation of its stocks of natural and financial capital and produced capital will be weakly sustainable. So we have a characteristic that of a weakly sustainable economy that focuses around the notion of savings, and that savings behavior is what will guarantee whether a particular outcome is sustainable or not. It guarantees whether future generations have access to as much well-being as we do today. And that's a long-standing outcome coming from work by Pearce and Atkinson. So one initial question that we started to ask was, has New Zealand been acting in a sustainable way? We're all aware with these stories about New Zealand being clean and green and various other things, but has it been acting sustainably? Well, I did some work with a couple of colleagues that was published a couple of years ago, which was testing for weak sustainability in New Zealand using a particular type of model called the genuine savings model. And I've pulled one diagram from that paper, which is a diagram which is looking at our sample period, which was 1950 to 2016, I think it was at the time. And it's looking at this thing called genuine savings as a proportion of gross national savings. So we've got some positive numbers, some negative numbers, and we've got this blue line, which is tracking what is happening to what we call the savings gap. And this dotted line is just a 10-period moving average of that savings gap. So when the blue line is above 0, when it's positive, it says that there is a positive savings gap. New Zealand isn't saving enough for future generations. So for this period, from 51 to 1976, New Zealand wasn't acting in a weakly sustainable way because it wasn't saving enough for future generations. When this gap is negative, and don't worry about this one too much, this is just a reclassification of some capitals. When we're below the line, New Zealand is saving more than it needs to for the future, so that future generations are going to have more capital available to them. And over here, we find that the New Zealand economy is mostly got a positive savings gap. It's not saving enough. So not sustainable, sustainable, not sustainable. And if we were to look at this over the whole period, New Zealand does look weakly sustainable because we get, just go back to show you, if we if we were to add up the areas in these 3 different distinct regions, we find that on average, genuine savings is creating a weakly sustainable New Zealand economy. But if we look at New Zealand from 2000 to 2010, the latter period, we find that on average, there's a 7% savings gap, which says that New Zealanders aren't saving enough for future generations. So New Zealand hasn't been consistently saving enough for future generations. Although it's weakly sustainable, this itself is quite a weak condition. But the recent past is telling us that New Zealand isn't saving enough. And the New Zealand government has been trying to tell us that for many, many years. This savings gap is problematic because it exerts pressure on long-run sustainability. If we were to continue to have this positive savings gap, then future populations would not have access to the amount of capital that we have today of the 4 capitals, and their well-being would decline. It would not be sustainable. So New Zealand in the recent past hasn't been acting sustainably. The question that we then move on to ask is, does becoming more circular help solve the problem of sustainably increasing well-being? Is circularity the key to sustainably increasing well-being? Well, anyone that's looked into this idea of circularity will normally come across some sort of quote, some sort of diagram that talks about what is referred to as the current linear model. So the current economic model that we find most developed countries are using is this linear model that take the raw materials, make the stuff that we're interested in, use the stuff that we're interested in by buying it, and then we throw it away. So this is referred to as a linear model, and much of the debate and interest on circularity is one that is trying to remove this linear notion and introduce a circular notion. Now, just to give you a quote from Keynes, Keynes is not going to be talking about circularity, but what Keynes says here is the difficulty, and the difficulty I'm going to be talking about here is a move from a linear to a circular model. The difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas. We're getting new ideas about circularity. The difficulty of moving from a linear model to a circular model is escaping from the old ideas. Keynes said that in the 30s, I assume. And that quote is just as important today in terms of moving from a linear to a circular model. It's not about developing the new ideas, it's how do we get rid of the old ones? Well, let's have a look at some circular economies. The origins of the circular economy, if we were to trace them, go back to Kenneth Boulding's 1966 paper or book, The Economics of the Coming Spaceship Earth. And if anyone's interested in circularity, it would be a useful place to read Boulding's book. Interestingly enough, most recent developments in circularity haven't come from economists, but much of the interest has come from engineers. Engineers seem to be incredibly interested in circularity, although they don't have the background in economics or business, which is why we have a team which mixes many disciplines, including engineers. Now, the working concept of circularity that we have in our program is that a circular economy is an economic system that replaces the end of life concept with one of reducing, alternatively reusing, recycling, and recovering materials in production and distribution and consumption processes, with the aim to accomplish sustainable development. So our working version of circularity has to be a circular model that accomplishes sustainable development. And that circular economy creates environmental quality, economic prosperity, and social equity to the benefit of current and future generations. Another way of saying it's sustainable. And the circular economy is enabled by novel business models and responsible consumers. So this is what we mean by the concept of circularity. Now, this leads us on to postulate and to argue that there are different versions of circular economies. It's not a circular economy. There are many versions of it. And we really think of circularity as a concept rather than simply a model. And it's a concept that has various stages to it. So stage one, the most simple sort of circular model, would be one where the recycling of materials, either used in the production process, the waste, or of final goods, is the first stage of circularity. And in its most simple form, this might be related to existing products and existing technologies. And some waste in this system would still likely not be used in production. There'd be some waste that's still waste. Or if it would be used, it's likely to have a lower value and might face competition from landfill. So many of you, if you're thinking about or working in a circular economy or living in a circular economy, will notice that recycling of goods can still lead to certain things still going to be thrown away in landfill. That's the simplest stage of a version of a circular economy that we consider. Stage two is all about biodegradability. So in this particular case, the final product or all waste is biodegradable with no residual toxins. That's a slightly higher level of circularity, but it's still a very limited form of circularity, because the only form of circularity that occurs is that the product or the waste gets biodegraded, and at best, that biodegraded material becomes compost to grow plants or to do something else with. But it's better than what we would find in stage one, because if everything were sufficiently biodegradable, things wouldn't be sent to landfill. Stage three involves changes in production to reduce the waste from making stuff and reduce the use of new to the market non-renewable resources. So stage three is quite distinct from the previous two stages, because we're now changing how things are made to reduce the amount of waste making those things and to reduce the amount of non-renewables used in production. Now, this would generally include, which is why we have engineers in our project, the development of new products and new processes and new materials, with an expectation that the proportion of non-renewable resources decline, as does the proportion of end-of-life products and waste going to landfill. So this is a step up from stage 1 and 2. And stage 4 is where we have changes in production design that embeds recycling and end-of-life requirements by producers. So this is another step up, because it says here we're not only just changing how we make existing products, we're changing how we design those products. And the design changes include designing a product so that its waste can be specifically used to make other products. And there's changes in production design which require that there's an end-of-life requirement on goods that can't easily be recycled. So that here the production of goods that most efficiently use non-renewable resources and embed recycling and end-of-life requirements, yet ensure that well-being is intertemporally maximized and sustainable. So this is a big deal for a circular economy, because it's not only got to do these things in terms of the goods, but it's got to make sure that that circular economy intertemporally maximizes sustainable well-being. So our mission is to find ways to sustainably increase well-being in New Zealand. Moving to a more circular economy driver may help to achieve this. A circular economy, properly defined in our sense, has to have well-being at its core, and a circular economy, as far as we're concerned, has to be premised on the principles of sustainability. And what that means, as far as we're concerned in our project to date, is that not all circular economy models and outcomes are equal. Some circular models will not be sustainably increasing well-being. They could be circular. And the part of the problem is, we believe that circularity has not been fully integrated with theories of sustainability and well-being, which is the challenge that we're trying to work on at the moment. Now, I'm aware of time and I want to try and get some questions in. So let me just finish on a couple of things that might be relevant to other countries. I think I was asked to do this. It's early days, but one of the things that we've already found is that well-being can mean quite different things to different people in different countries. If you are thinking of, or countries are thinking about trying to increase well-being, you have to have a pretty clear notion of what you mean by well-being. And you have to have a pretty clear notion about how you're going to measure it to find out whether it's increasing or not. GDP was a really good place because GDP was easy to measure. But as Stiglitz has told us, and many others have told us, GDP does not measure well-being well. Make sure you have a definition and a goal that has buy-in from all the population, and really be aware that inequality may well be a real problem for you increasing the well-being of everybody. Increasing one well-being is one thing, but sustainably increasing well-being is another. So what concept of sustainability do you want to use, and how will you assess if you are sustainably increasing well-being? If you've already got elements of circularity in your country, what stage of circularity is your economy in? Stage 1, 2, 3, or 4? Is circularity considered in relation to sustainability? So do any of your discussions, or will any of your discussions, talk about circularity and sustainability together? And does circularity require government intervention? If so, what type of intervention? And different countries will have different requirements for intervention or not. And does that move to circularity benefit all members of the population. So we've got equity issues here. Make sure you've got a fully integrated approach, and circularity alone doesn't guarantee long-run sustainability. Now I'm going to stop at that because I've got some slides that I won't go into now, which is showing you some of the materials that we've created in our work. I'd like to leave at least a little bit of time for questions, if that is okay for you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Go ahead. Go ahead. So, yeah. So, you're finishing?
Yes, I'm going to take questions now.
Okay, okay.
I can put it back on if you like, but
Yeah. Thanks, Professor Les Oxley.